Last week I did a video titled 5 Myths About Old School Yu-Gi-Oh! And in that video we talked about some rulings, we talked about some metagame trends, and that's fun because I enjoy talking about old school Yu-Gi-Oh! In today's video though, I want to talk not only about old school Yu-Gi-Oh! But also new school Yu-Gi-Oh! We're going to talk about 5 ways that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has changed since 2002, which is when it came to America, and that's really exciting because the game has changed in a lot of ways since 2002, and I do realize that this will attract some comments, not all of them, but some comments from people that really hate new school Yu-Gi-Oh! I want to make this video mostly about positive changes, or at the very least neutral changes that are just things that are different from back in the day. I do want to mention that there are tons of videos out there from old school players that are talking about how much new school Yu-Gi-Oh! Sucks. This is not going to be one of those videos. I love all aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! I love all years of Yu-Gi-Oh! And in today's video I just want to talk about some of the differences between way back in the day and right now. Starting off at number 5, we have tournament size. And I mention this because I paid attention and I read a lot of articles from metagame.com back in the day. If you don't know what that website is, basically it was a website where they talked about new cards coming out and new packs coming out, but also they chronicled what happened at big tournaments. However, when you look at those tournament sizes from back in the day, you might notice that they're not nearly as big as they are right now. In fact, the Shonen Jump Championships, which were like the YCS of now, were only about 100 to 200 people in most cases. That's not to say they didn't sometimes have really large tournaments. Sometimes they got close to 1,000. I think even a few times they surpassed 1,000. But in general, it isn't until modern eras of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like we're talking the Shonen Jump switching over to YCSs, where we finally get tournaments on a regular basis hitting 1,500 players, 2,000 players, and even more than that in some cases. And that's really exciting from a competitor's standpoint. These days, if you want to go to a tournament that's like 100 to 200 people, you're just looking at the basic regional qualifiers. But when you go to YCSs, you're playing against hundreds, if not thousands of other players. It really helps it be more skillful and more exciting. The tournaments are longer and you have more matches to actually play the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! At number 4, we have the Fusion deck, or the formerly known as Fusion deck, transitioning into the Extra deck. Nowadays, and for a very long time, over 10 years, we've been stuck with the Extra deck, but back in the day, it was just called the Fusion deck because the only monsters that went in there were fusion monsters. Now, I know there are a lot of mixed emotions about synchros and Xyzs and links and pendulums, but the fact of the matter is that Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole has changed a lot, and part of that, or a lot of that, is the introduction of Extra deck monsters besides fusions. I've done videos talking about synchros and Xyzs and all those cards a bunch of times at this point, but one of the things that makes it very interesting is that this is something that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has that most other card games don't. I'm told that some other card games, I think Vanguard has a similar style of Extra deck that's next to your main deck. However, in most card games like Pokemon and Magic and Hearthstone, you're just stuck with your main and side deck in between games. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Though, you have access to these Extra deck monsters, which makes the game a lot more consistent because suddenly you have access to these cards that you don't have to draw. You just have to build your deck around summoning them, which gives Yu-Gi-Oh! A really unique form of consistency that other card games simply don't have. And I completely understand that many ex-Yu-Gi-Oh! Players that used to play way back in the day really don't like these new Extra deck types of summoning. I think at this point most people have accepted synchro summoning that's been out for 10 years, but I still see a few comments about Xyz summoning, and I see a ton of negative comments about pendulum and link summoning. Here's the deal. I find that in many cases the people complaining about these new types of summoning don't really play the game anyway, and they just don't like them because they're confusing. That's perfectly fine, but I think a lot of people are really hard on these new summoning mechanics because it can be scary when a game that you know changes in a pretty dramatic fashion. In the cases of pendulum and link summoning, not only did we get new card types like synchros and Xyzs, but also the field itself changed, which was a pretty controversial decision on Konami's part. I completely get it from Konami's perspective though, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game without set rotation, so they have to keep pushing the envelope further and further. One of the ways that they can do that is by adding these new Extra deck types. I think it'll get to a point, if we're not already there already, where Konami really can't keep adding these Extra deck types every 3 years because it'll get too crazy. Hopefully they sort of dial it back and do some more main deck types. That might be kind of interesting, but we'll just have to wait and see. At number 3, we have drawing when you go first. This change happened back in in 2014, the summer before we got pendulum summoning, and this was one of the most controversial changes I've ever seen. For a long time, like many other games out there, pretty much every single card game pretty much, Yu-Gi-Oh! Let you draw one card when you went first. The problem was that this worked for a long time when decks weren't as consistent, but when decks started to become more and more consistent, it just gave the first turn player too much of an advantage. Even these days, when the first turn player only has 5 cards and the second turn player draws 1, so they go up to 6 cards, going first is still a huge advantage. What Konami was thinking was that by not letting the first turn player draw 1 card, they only had 5 cards against their opponent's 5 cards on that first turn. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because as Yu-Gi-Oh! Has sort of stayed around year after year after year, we've gotten more and more hand traps, cards that can be activated when you go second right from your hand. Cards like Ash Blossom and Effect Failure and Max C, before it was banned, were all cards put into the game to prevent your opponent from making too crazy of a board before you had a chance to respond to their effects. Now, whether or not you like hand traps or dislike hand traps doesn't really matter, but what matters is that Konami didn't like that when you went second, you only had 5 possible draws to out your opponent's cards when they were building up their crazy board, but your opponent had 6 cards to build their board with. That's kind of the line of thinking that Konami was saying when they were like, okay, having 5 cards versus your opponent's 6 cards doesn't really make sense because the person going first doesn't really have to deal with any trap cards or interruptions outside of those hand traps, which you have to draw, and sometimes you only draw 1, and sometimes you draw 0 of them. So in the cases especially where your opponent doesn't draw any interruptions, it was just simply too powerful being able to go first and draw that extra card. I would like to point out, just as a side note here, that in Hearthstone, even though you still draw a card when you go first, you start off with 1 less card than your opponent, which is basically if like Yu-Gi-Oh! Started you out with 4 cards and then had you draw 1 to have that 5th card. It's a little bit differently set up in Yu-Gi-Oh! But the idea is the exact same in both games. At number 2, we have a shift in focus to what Konami cares about in terms of deck building. For example, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster cards are almost entirely the focus of most strategies. But if you look at old school Yu-Gi-Oh! That's not the case at all. While monster cards are present, because of course they have to be in most cases, spells and traps are the more powerful cards in the deck. You have cards like Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity and Monster Reborn and Heavy Storm. These are the big heavy hitters of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck back in the day, whereas nowadays it's not really the case. That's not to say powerful spells and traps don't exist. That's not really what I'm trying to say here, because yes, there's still Twin Twisters and Infinite Impermanence and other cards like that. However, in a lot of cases, when you look at a main deck, all of the monsters are supported by those spells. The spells aren't independent effects. Oftentimes they're searcher cards or cards that can be searched with the monsters. Very different sort of idea from back in the day where the monster cards were just sort of there a lot of the time. I mean, even if we go way back in the day when people were actually legitimately playing normal monsters in an effort to draw them and normal summon them, that's a pretty big departure to what you see in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! The number one change since 2002 in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a focus on archetypes instead of generic cards, especially in relation to monsters. Don't get me wrong, there certainly are generic cards out there these days. I just described a few of them, but if you look at 2019 decks, almost all of them are based in part by archetypes. There certainly are decks out there that don't focus on archetypes as much. If you look at the Danger Thunder list, about 10 of the cards are Dangers, 10 of them are Thunders, and then the other 20 are just a random mishmash of Chaos and Dragon cards that all combine to make one wild strategy. That's very different from if you look at a Salamangreat deck or a Sky Striker list where almost all the cards in the main deck are either Salamangreat cards or Sky Striker cards. This just didn't happen in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! There were some archetypes out there. We had Archfiends and Gravekeepers and Harpies, I believe, are credited as the first real archetype. However, those things just weren't as powerful in some cases as just playing a deck that's full of a variety of monster cards. And I realized, just like in the case of talking about the fusion deck versus the extra deck, that archetypes and the focus on them in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very sore spot for a lot of ex-Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. If you look at old school deck lists, you have a bunch of random monsters. Sometimes you have a sort of theme with like warriors or chaos monsters, but these days almost every deck out there is going to be based in part by that archetype, and for some people they don't like that at all. all. I think there's this very big misconception that decks with archetypes build themselves. That's something that I hear a lot of ex-Yu-Gi-Oh players say that is just flat out wrong. In almost every single case of an archetype deck, there are cards that you don't put that have the archetype name, and you don't put them in there just because they're not good enough. In a lot of cases, you have archetype cards that are 3-ofs and 2-ofs and 1-ofs, and some of them that you just don't play at all. And I get that, especially for ex-Yu-Gi-Oh players, when you see a deck like Salamangreats, like Skyspeakers, and most of the cards are either hand traps or archetype cards, it can seem like the deck built itself, but that just isn't true. There are so many sort of fine choices that go into determining which cards you play which ratios of, or even which cards you include at all, and if they're good against the current meta. I get that it can seem like, oh, Konami just stamped the name on them and suddenly all those cards in the archetype are good, but that's sort of just missing a big aspect of deck building, not to mention it's missing a huge aspect of actually playing the strategy. I can't count the number of times that I've seen someone that's a more budget player, more casual player, pick up a meta deck on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro and just make the worst plays that I've ever seen. That is a very, very common occurrence. It can seem like it's just easy and autopilot to play these decks that are based on archetypes, but in a lot of cases, in most cases, that's just not true. Not to mention that even though they're not archetype cards, there certainly were a ton of staple spells, traps, and monsters in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! These were cards that you automatically included into every single deck that you played, and it's one of the reasons that Konami implemented the ban list. There's a whole article about it where they talk about how every single list had the same 27-ish cards, and that was before you even determined which strategy you were playing. Of course, those 27-ish cards weren't archetype cards, so people maybe don't think of them as being staple cards, but back in the day, you pretty much had to play those if you wanted to be successful. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on 5 ways that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has changed since 2002. I'll catch you in the next video. Goodbye.